I seem to just get up every day and I do the thing I do in the town I live in. And there's this other part of my brain that recognizes that it is missing a whole section of my life, but I don't know how to acknowledge it in my existence.
Lisa Munga, coming to terms with the life she's having in the UK and the one she misses in Cameroon. This is Writer's Mosaic, What We Leave, We Carry, the series that tells the true life stories of migration to the UK.
I'm Lisa Munga. I was born in Bamenda, in Cameroon, western part of Cameroon, and I was born in 1969. My mother was, because she has passed away, was American. She met my father at Oregon State University on the west coast of the US, fell in love with this incredibly charismatic, dark-skinned man, as he was described by his Oregon colleagues at university, and moved to Cameroon, which was just post-colonization when she arrived in 1968, and made a life there for 30 years, fell in love with it, and we grew up there. It's funny, I look back now and not even realizing how privileged we were in this tiny village primary school we went to. My father was a genealogist, and he was in charge of a huge research centre in a remote part of Cameroon, which was looking at research into cattle and corn, maize, and that sort of thing. So we grew up on a lovely, huge farm. We had, I remember, cooks, drivers, being driven to school every day, chauffeured to school. And it was an idyllic life. It was just beautiful. And it's funny because my brother and I visited Yorkshire and the Lake District in January of this year. And it was the first time he had been to the north of England. And he could not believe how much it was like Bambui and Bambili. And I said, yep, that's why I love England. That's why I still live here, because it's so reminiscent of my years from really 0 to 7 that we spent in Bambui and Bambili. I had no images of England. My mother was American. By the age of 4, she would talk about undergraduate school in California. I was learning to type by 5 because I was going to go to grad school and I was going to have to do my research papers. So England was not part of my makeup. I happened to come to England by accident. I met my ex-husband here, and I remember my first visit, or even flying over England, and just being amazed at the hedgerows and how green the land was. And I arrived and I thought, I'm home. I think if somebody had sort of read my palm when I was even 15 and said, you'd live in England, I'd say, no, I'm going to the States. That's where I'm going to grow up. But deep in my DNA is Scottish heritage. My mother's side of the family were predominantly Irish. My grandfather was of Germanic heritage and still very Germanic in his parenting. My mother she talked a lot, so she talked a lot about her growing up when we were children. My grandfather, even though we lived in Cameroon, sent us a box of books twice a year, huge box of books. So it was The Hungry Caterpillar when we were 2 and 3, Winnie the Poohs. When I was 9, Enid Blyton start to arrive. There are a couple of books I almost want to have a conversation with my brother about, particularly when I go for country walks here, was about roasting a pheasant and playing cricket, which was such anathemas because they were not part of I didn't know what cricket was or roasting a pheasant. Being other, even in Cameroon, was a big part of my own heritage. The food actually was the biggest difference. My mother ruled the kitchen in the sense of we had a cook. So the cook learned to cook roast and macaroni and cheese and pancakes. And so we did not have ndole or eru. I think the first time I had goat meat, I was 8. The world my mother had created for us, actually, we had Emmanuel the cook, we had 2 Graces who were our nannies. We had a really tight structure. Being from a Germanic father, we had a lot of structure. We had bells, embarrassingly. Cook rang the bell, Emmanuel rang the bell, and we knew it was time to eat. I was almost living in another culture that I wasn't fully part of. I remember the first years after my parents separated, I was about 8. We had a stepmom who cooked food from her village, Batibo. I had stomach aches for about 3 years. The story of how I ended up here starts with meeting my ex-husband when I was 16 and he was 18, and we met the summer before he cleverly gained a scholarship to study engineering at Cardiff University. And so we had a lovely summer of long walks and just chatting. And he was lucky enough to get a scholarship and move to England. And I thought I'd never see him again. Quite a few years later, we got reintroduced through a friend. And so got talking on the phone, and I decided I'd come and visit. And I came to visit high summer of 94. And I arrived in England. He was working in Henley. Henley Festival had just been. Henley Regatta had just been. The streets in Henley were full of hanging baskets and blue skies. And it was just idyllic. The Thames flowed beautifully. I went on walks while he worked in the daytime. And I just thought, God, I could do this. And so we talked about me moving to England. We had a deal where whoever got a job in the other person's country would move. And I happened to get a job in England. I got a job working for the same company as a marketer, for the same company he was working at. And so I went out. My mother had moved to Cameroon with 2 big trunks in 68. I went to the shops and bought 2 big trunks, wooden trunks. Went and found a shipping company and shipped all my belongings, sold my car, and moved here on the 4th of November, 1994, which was a Thursday. I started work the following Monday, whatever that was. I was coping with traffic. I lived in a tiny village in Bamenda. There was no traffic. All of a sudden, I was commuting. This was my first adult job in a new country. So there was so much I was adapting to life here. The metric system, driving on the other side of the road, the language. I remember going to my interview. God knows I barely understood his English because it was so different. So there was so much I was grappling with, adapting and adopting. I remember watching Chris, my ex-husband, navigate a roundabout, observing that you came to the lines, you had to stop, you had to look for the car on the right, you had to change gears, you then had to try and squeeze into the traffic, engage into the roundabout. There were no roundabouts when I was growing up in Cameroon. So this was a whole new level of driving, and also being on the wrong side of the road. All of that were all things I had to learn to do. Interestingly, marrying a Cameroonian who was not as plugged into the English society as I am now was also another dimension. When you come into a new country, people make choices whether they stay within their circle of friends and therefore keep the rituals of their original home country rituals, cultures, language, food. And Chris was still very much an African man. He wanted his meals cooked, his African meals cooked. Sundays he wanted to spend with his Cameroonian friends. So being married to a Cameroonian, I think, limited my assimilation into British culture for quite a while. And it only came when I had children, because I almost feel like I grew up with them. When they learnt stuff at school, the books they brought home from school taught me about British life and really opened my world around the friendships I have, the friendships I've cultivated over the last 20 years. A lot of other people I met at school, at my children's school. And it's just, when I talk about school, and I almost say when we were at school, because I was also at school, even though they were going to school, because I was learning with them. The nuances of British culture I learned through them. It was liberating for them to come home with what they had learned. It's funny, only the other day I went to the recycling centre, and I'll never forget my children saying to me, "Mum, you know you don't put batteries in the bin." I'm going, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, they taught us at school you don't do that. In Cameroon, we just put batteries in the bin." And I never learned you did. And that's one of the 50,000 things. That's the one that stuck with me. That was such an, it's like, "What? You don't put batteries in the bin? Oh, God." And they're like, "No, Mum, nobody does that." But there were so many things. All the Christmas plays, costume making, World Book Day, the thinking that had to go behind all of that. The sports days at school. I not only learnt about what other parents did, but I also got to meet such a broad breadth of society that without children, I would not have had that opportunity. Actually, I've been in the UK this year for 30 years. I have been privileged to work for my local council, we call it local government, for the past 20 years, again, interestingly, this year. And in that time, I've done a variety of roles. And I think having left Cameroon as an 18-year-old and been on a journey of migration, lived in America, lived in Reading at the very beginning. When I first started working in Reading, it was really fascinating to be working with people who belonged to a place, who had 5-10 generations in the same town. It was interesting to be serving in a community where there was such a passion and an ownership for that community, how they developed it, how they felt strongly about where the theatre went, where the sports centre was, what the local people needed. That was wonderful to be part of what I do. In my amazing journey of work life, I became the superintendent registrar for the register office and managed that register office for 10 years. It is part of the birth to death journey for every one of us. We register our births, we register marriages, we register deaths. And part of the responsibilities for that role included conducting citizenship ceremonies every week. And each week we would get a new group of citizens who would have gone through complex applications, paid lots of fees, taken tests, and the final journey would be arriving at a register office to go through a ceremony where they would pledge allegiance to the king, swear an oath that they would be upstanding citizens and that they would contribute to life in this country. At the end of that, they would receive a certificate, and in some lovely cases, they would take a photograph with myself. And it's interesting because I had, in a different time in life, gone through that very process. I had also taken part in a citizenship ceremony where I received my certificate. My mother was a beautiful, elegant, slender, tall, with black hair down to her waist. Striking figure. She was so upright. And she was quite known in the neighbourhood we lived in. But as Cameroon's wonderful identity, of self began to be stronger, there was such a resistance to foreigners. And she was constantly, even though she had married a Cameroonian and had 2 children and raised them in Cameroon, she was constantly reminded she needed to go home. She needed to go back to where she came from because Cameroon was not her home. And for all the love in the world, she was not Cameroonian and so felt other, and in the end decided it wasn't safe for her anymore. So she decided in 95, after arriving in Cameroon in 1968, to leave Cameroon and go back to the States. I was relieved at a sort of a practical level because my mother was sleepwalking and locking the doors because she was so frightened. But I was really sad for her because she had made such a wonderful life in Cameroon. She had friends, mentors, women she shared. She had a community of women she chatted to all the time. She was part of the choir. My partner, Andrew, who lives the other side of Reading, Andrew looks out on a field of sheep, and we walk through sheep, cows every day and cornfields, and I am happy. Being out in the open walking are the key reasons I have stayed in this country. No other country, and I tell my kids all the time, so few countries on the planet have such great access for footpaths and walking. So I can be anywhere in England and I take out my footpath app or buy a local OS map and I can walk. And I love that. I love the countryside. I love the openness. I love the greenery, the undulating gentleness of the land are deep in my psyche. I think I'm genuinely a human of 2 cultures. I love the solitude of England. I love my own space. I love being quiet. But when I go back to Cameroon and the bustlingness of family life, I really enjoy that. Everybody gets into your business. Everybody's wanting to know how you are. I can enjoy that for an amount of time and then I think I've had enough. I need to go back to the quiet. I live in suburbia, and in suburbia you don't see people walking around. You have to make an effort to know your neighbours, but there is an unspoken understanding that it is a hello and it stops there. We are not really friends. I'm fortunate enough to have another migrant who lives on the next street, and my children would go and borrow the odd pepper that needed to complete a recipe, or salt, or last loo roll. And our children grew up in that, even though we lived a street apart, to be in each other's houses all the time. And that was the privilege of having a neighbour who came from a different culture, and that culture was similar to my home culture. So our children have shared that. If anything, the most difficult thing is living on a street where there are boundaries, they're very solid boundaries. There isn't that fluidity that I have in an African culture. My lovely friend comes from Ecuador and again, very similar timings, has lived here for 30 years, has raised 2 children here. Our children went to the same school, so they went to school, they walked to school together, they came home together, they shared playtimes together, and it felt very easy. We weren't as formal with each other, ever. Whereas I find in our English cultures, 3 o'clock is 3 o'clock. It's far more rigid, whereas I found the Latin culture and the African culture easier. Sadly, my mum died when the children were 3 and 5. She, having been such a strict parent, she found my bohemian way of raising the children quite interesting. I was a very earthy mother. Would sit on the floor and play with the children. And bedtime was bedtime, but, I would give allowances by 10 or 15 minutes. Whereas we grew up with a timer. Everything was timed. We weren't picked up if it wasn't time to be picked up out of the cot, that sort of thing. I found my people. A child of mixed heritage. I love my African background. I love the fact that I am of dual heritage. I feel I can slide into my very English partner's life with his family here. I'm accepted with his family. I've been able to adapt all the different ways of living here. And no, I love living here. I wouldn't leave. I think I'm going to be buried here somewhere. It's poignant for me in my 30th year. I was telling my partner the other day that it is my 30th year, and I would like to celebrate the friendships I have made in this country, the support network, the love of the land that I have, what it has given me as a person. Has been incredible, actually. I've had the privilege to raise 2 children here. We didn't even talk about rugby. There's very, very English passion that, the English have. My very Cameroonian son coming to, I'd never been to a rugby game, and now he plays Premiership rugby. And that's been a whole new experience, a different experience I would never have had I not lived here. Rugby in itself was an education. I had a 11-year-old who decided to pick up this oval-shaped ball and found he was good at it. My Sundays became taken over. I stopped going to church because every Sunday is rugby. Supporting him from the sidelines, learning the language of the game. It's meant I've travelled. He had the privilege of playing for England. We went to South Africa to represent England. I'm participating every week in the life and blood of being an English person, even though I'm a foreigner. I left my father behind in Cameroon, and I found that really difficult. And as I am becoming older and reflecting that I am probably of a similar age now that my father was when I left Cameroon, and I can't imagine not having my children around me for another 30 years of life. And it is only now I'm really reflecting on what a huge loss of experience for both of us it has been, this concept of living in the diaspora. I seem to just get up every day and I do the thing I do in the town I live in. And there's this other part of my brain that recognizes that it is missing a whole section of my life, but I don't know how to acknowledge it in my existence beyond just accepting that it is there. And when I could talk to my dad, I did as often as I could. I went to visit, not as often as I would like, and I loved it so much when he was able to come and visit and be in my home here and see my children in their day-to-day lives, see where they went to school, and have that context was enriching but not long enough.